Hello, everyone. Pastor Will here for Sunday, January 3rd, 2021. Our message today comes out of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. I think it was last Sunday that I may have mentioned this text. Could have been the Sunday before. It's John's infant narrative, or the birth of Jesus narrative, if you will. Don't worry about adjusting your screen. If you're seeing darkness, then you're seeing the right thing. This would be life without Christ, the light of the world, in it. It's a world of darkness. As we may know, cold is the absence of heat. If you want to define cold, you have to define it in comparison to heat and its absence. The same is true of darkness. Darkness cannot be properly understood apart from understanding light. Darkness is the absence of light. God created the world with the idea that people would not live in darkness, but in light. And in John's gospel, we see that light is understood to be Jesus, or I'll take it a step further, God and the Holy Spirit. Apart from having light in our lives, we will die, theologically speaking. Apart from light and having light, we live impoverished lives, lives that are lacking, both physically and spiritually. I read a report back in 2016 that some economists from the University of Oxford came up with a new idea to measure global poverty. Now, usually when you're trying to measure global poverty, you employ a lot of different matrices to see where people live who are in poverty and this sort of thing. But they came up with a way that they could measure the poverty pockets of the world much cheaper, much quicker, and with much better coverage. And that was simply to determine the darkest areas of the world upon nightfall. When the sun set, they used satellite imaging to determine the darkest areas on the globe. And what they found out was quite interesting. You can measure poverty by darkness. In nations where light is readily available to people, those nations have a higher success rate of individuals. Individuals who get home when the sun goes down and are there at home, they can turn on a light and they can see and they can do other things. Perhaps they'll go to school or further their education or relax, read a book, watch a movie, whatever. People who don't have access to light have very few options once the sun goes down. They live more of an impoverished life. They live a life without. Those who have light in their lives have more opportunities for success in life than those who do not have this option and must live or exist in the dark. Now, a lot of people live in the dark theologically or spiritually speaking and aren't even aware of it. We know that living in darkness scientifically speaking, can cause us to do and to imagine the worst possible outcomes in life. Living in darkness or being overcome by darkness causes us to live hopelessly. When I was a young man, a child really, I was in college and I worked as an orderly at St. Mary's Hospital in Athens, Georgia. And I worked with one of my best friends. We're friends to this day. And I made new friends. But one of our jobs, I was an orderly, and one of my jobs was to transport patients. And one of my jobs was to transport bodies to the morgue. And we worked 11 to 7, graveyard shift. And typically, if things got kind of slow and boring, one of the things that my friend Ray and I liked to do was we would get a gurney, and one of us would lay on the gurney and put a sheet over us, and the other one would push the gurney onto the elevator, and we would lay a trap and wait for some unsuspecting employee. We only did this to employees, not to patients. We only used the employee elevator. We would wait for them to come onto the elevator. And usually when the elevator doors opened and they saw one of us standing there with a sheet over a dead body, no one would get on the elevator. But we would cajole them into getting into the elevator with us. We'd say, please, I don't want to ride downstairs by myself. Please, would you get on the elevator with us? And they would have compassion for us, and someone would inevitably get onto the elevator with us. And as soon as the elevator doors closed, after a moment, whoever was laying under the sheet would reach out and touch the unsuspecting employee and basically cause them to nearly have a heart attack. Of course, I was very young and didn't realize the danger of this joke. I really, truly could have hurt someone. And so I guess I regret it for that reason, but I don't regret it because it makes an excellent sermon illustration. And one night, I was working alone, and I got a call to take a body down to the morgue. And so I went upstairs, I can't remember, I'll say the 6th floor, and I got the patient, put him on the gurney, put a sheet over him, put him on the elevator, and started to descend down into the sub-basement where the morgue was. And as I started to descend, suddenly the elevator just stopped of its own accord. It just stopped. I had nothing to do with it. And so I started just pressing all these buttons and hoping the elevator would start again. And then, to my horror of all horrors, the lights went out in the elevator and I was in total darkness with a corpse. I was 19 years old, and unfortunately, I had also been reading Stephen King's book, It. Now, Stephen King, I've read all of his books, but at that time, It was one of the scariest books I had ever read. And I had been reading it that night in the break room when I got a call to go and get this body and transport it to the morgue. And so as I stood there in the darkness, my mind started to imagine the most horrible scenarios involving that corpse. And I was convinced in my mind that I could hear the corpse starting to rustle the sheet and starting to move and starting to sit up, and the sheet falling down from over its face as it sat up straight, and it reaching toward me with its hands and its fingers. And in my mind's eye, there in the darkness, I was terrified. And I was convinced that this monster was reaching out to me to grab me. And I could feel myself falling into the abyss of insanity as a scream unlike any scream I have ever screamed started to burst itself out of my throat and out of my mouth to demonstrate sheer, utter terror. Just at this moment, the lights came back on, and I saw instantly the corpse was still laying there, the sheet was still in place. Everything I had imagined, all the terror I had imagined, there enveloped in the darkness, was just in my imagination. But in just the instant of that experience, I lost all hope. After the lights came on, after a couple of seconds, the elevator started to move. It got down to the basement, the elevator doors opened, and I pushed the gurney out and headed toward the morgue. And between the morgue and the elevator was dispatch. And as I went by dispatch, I heard a lot of people laughing. And I was able to look in a window and I could see some of the people I had played tricks on with my little elevator fakery over time. And I realized I had been had. And I had to doff my imaginary hat at them because I had been had quite gloriously. But more than anything, I was just thrilled to be back into the light and life. To live in darkness is to live in terror. A lot of people live in darkness on a daily basis. They live with food insecurity and wondering if they're going to eat or be able to feed their families. They live with home insecurity and wonder if they're going to have a safe place to sleep at night. If you've ever slept on the streets, you know how scary that can be, to wonder if you have a safe place. You know you're not going to be comfortable. You know you're going to be very uncomfortable and frightened. You don't know who's going to come upon you. You know you're going to wake up with an aching back and sore all over. But you're just afraid. And horror of all horrors, perhaps, is not just sleeping on the streets for a night or a couple of nights or a week, but wondering if you're doomed forever to be overcome by the darkness and sleep on the streets for the rest of your life without your own proper home, without shelter, without a place together with friends and family, without a place to retreat and have sanctuary. Another darkness that is common in our society is inequality among people. Different races, different socioeconomic standards, men and women, different sexual identities, all different kinds of ways that people live in darkness when a society considers them to not be up to the standards that they determine. This is a way that people live in darkness. Lack of proper health care. My father died because of lack of proper health care. It infuriates me when I think about it, and I get even more angry and upset when I think about how many millions in our nation, the United States of America, die needlessly every year because of lack of proper health care, because they don't have the money. It's that simple. That's living in darkness. It's living in fear. War and death. We have more refugees in the world at this time than the world has ever known. Almost 100 million people have been displaced because of war and are wandering around the globe seeking shelter and safety, seeking a place that doesn't reek of death. This is just like Jesus and his family when Jesus was a baby, when he was born and his family took off to Egypt as refugees with nowhere to lay their head. Jesus spent his whole life, his whole adult life, living that way. As he tells us in the Gospels that he had no place to lay his head. But he did have friends he stayed with, people who cared about him, people who loved him, people who showed him compassion. And that's what makes the world a dark, dark place, a lack of compassion. And living without food or with food insecurity and home insecurity, inequality, without proper health care, under the constant threat of war and death and violence, living in this way is the way of the world. It's normal for the world. In the world, the lack of compassion and care and love is normal. Many of us can probably recall growing up and hearing from our parents or saying to our children that life is not fair. And that's correct, it's not fair. And it also, sadly enough, is a place of darkness. When John's gospel speaks of the light coming into the world and coming into the darkness of which John is speaking is the world. A world that does not know compassion as defined by God in Jesus the Messiah. Compassion is that which makes the light shine. John's gospel tells us that God came into the world in the person of Jesus to push aside the darkness with light, and that the darkness, try as it might, cannot ultimately overcome the light. The light will always prevail, always. Disciples of Jesus, followers of the Christ, people who say that they are church members are called to imitate Jesus in the world. Therefore, we are called to be the light in the world, a light that cannot be overcome, a light that refuses to be overcome. And the way we refuse to be overcome is to imitate Christ and his compassion and his refusal to live as the world insisted he lived or he live. The world insists that the church live like everybody else, that our priorities are looking out for number one. And what is it we brag about here? Let me think. Pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and being independent and powerful. All of these things are the very opposite of what Jesus taught and lived. He was not independent. He depended on everything in life. He depended on God. He gave up all of his power to be with us and show us how to live as the light, full of compassion and love for the world, so that people didn't live in hopelessness and sorrow. When the church refuses to be any different than the world, then the church worships that which is other than the light, that which is other than Christ. I saw on the news this morning that a 59-year-old man with a 16-year-old boy in Atlanta, Georgia, he's always been able to take care of his family, this man, and now, because times are so incredibly horrible and the darkness is really moving into every neighborhood now, he had to resort to go into a food pantry, this man, so that he could make sure that his son ate and that he ate, so they would be okay and not die. And so he goes to the food pantry so that his family was not overcome by the darkness. And he made this surprising comment. He said, I've never been to a food pantry, but it was nice to be able to have that option because it told me that some people actually care about me and my son. That's the gospel. Showing others, showing the stranger, showing the despised, showing the neglected, showing the vulnerable, showing the hated, showing the enemy compassion, and that their lives matter and that God cares about them. What does the light look like that refuses to be overcome? It looks like that. It looks like a food pantry. It looks like a homeless shelter. It looks like a church saying, you know what? Our building is not what we worship. And we have room for the homeless. Let's move out all of these benches we only use once a month, once a week, if that. And let's change the way we do things and show people compassion. Show people Christ. Show people the light so they're not overcome by the darkness. The church that truly follows Christ is a beacon of hope that doesn't exist like the rest of the world. It is a beacon of hope that cares for other people in such a way that the brightness of that light of caring and compassion cannot be extinguished or overcome or put out, because it refuses to allow that in the real choices that it takes. It truly imitates Christ rather than just saying it worships God. True worship of God is imitating Jesus in the world and being a bright, shining light that will not be overcome by the darkness. Almost everybody I know has a mobile telephone. I carry my mobile telephone with me pretty much everywhere I go. It's always with me. And many, many times when I come home at night, there's no outside light where I live, and I fumble for my keys to open the door to go inside. It's a constant thing for me, fumbling for the keys, trying to keep the key out when I get out of the truck, seeing it in the light and making a dash for the door and hopefully trying to insert the key. But I can't see and I fumble around in the dark. Sometimes I drop the keys and then I get upset. And then I always tend to forget that I have that mobile telephone with me and that it in itself can provide light to help me see how to insert the key and to find the key. Not only does it provide light of its own, but it has a flashlight on it that I could use. But I just rarely do. I rarely think about it. I've gotten into the habit of fumbling around in the dark instead of getting in the habit of using the light that I have available to me. And that's how so many of us go through life. We have access to God, who is the light that will not be overcome in the darkness. But we're so used to fumbling around in the dark. We're so used to living as the world dictates in darkness that we've forgotten how to access the light so that the light can shine in our own world so we're not fumbling around lost. But we're found and full of hope and love. That is the call of the church. That is the call of discipleship. To not be overcome by the darkness, but to be different. To be like Christ, the light of the world. May you know the peace and the light of Christ, and may you be that light of Christ in the dark world. Amen.